You wake up in 1950 with $50,000. What do you do? Story 1. Check the infant death records from 20 years ago, find a name you like, and then request the birth certificate. Presto, new identity. Don't try that now. Go to LA, buy property at the edge of the popular areas, and sell it as the city grows. Repeat. If you're a woman, that third thing would be to find a man willing to marry you so that you can have a bank account. And if you're a minority, get the hell out of the South first and go to a major city in the North, ideally New York. In the 50s, you want Detroit. It was the richest city in the US at the time. Just don't buy real estate there. Save that for New York City or California. Detroit was segregated into the 60s, and many of the suburbs were all white until the 70s. There was very little living space for non-white passing minorities in the city during that era. Also keep in mind the 1967 Detroit riot, one of the worst in American history, primarily came from how the police treated minorities in the city during that era. If you were white, yeah, Detroit would have been awesome in the 1950s. Otherwise, not so much. Also, keep in mind, people mostly think of the KKK as a Southern thing. Michigan has a very dark history with the Klan, to the point that Malcolm X believed that they had a hand in killing his father in East Lansing, not quite Detroit Metro, a little west of, in the 30s. The mayor of Dearborn in the late 50s, to anyone reading unfamiliar with the way Detroit is laid out, it's one of the largest metro areas in the country, covering a large portion of the southeast corner of the state, which Detroit is only a comparatively very small part of, and is comprised of many towns and cities including Ann Arbor and Flint. Was so proud of how racist the city was, he claimed to a Montgomery, Alabama newspaper that they were better at it than Alabama was. Nah, Detroit is a bad choice for a minority in the 1950s, both short-term and long-term. Not being able to do everything you want to do on day one wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, though. You would be smart to lay low, get a decent-paying job, and acclimate yourself to the culture before making big moves. You can't just start buying properties left and right and not expect people to ask questions about where you're from, your home life, etc. You would need time to develop a believable backstory and start acting like you were around in the 30s and 40s before making real connections. Story 2. To put inflation in perspective, my dad bought a house in the Portland West Hills for $2,400 in 1961. He made 4 payments of $600 from his wages as a machinist. I looked on Zillow a couple of years ago, and now that house is worth $2,100,000. $50,000 was a lot of money in 1950. My grandma lived in Cupertino in a house that she bought for $6,000 back in the 60s. She said when she was a little girl, she used to dream of someday being rich and living in $1 million house. She'd say, "I imagined it would be a huge, fantastical mansion with a massive garden and a dozen bedrooms. Now I'm old and I have $1 million house, and it's just the same darn shack I've always had." That $50,000 is equal to $650,000 today. No paperwork means you need to get a death certificate and birth certificate of a baby born in 1930. Take the BC, get an ID card, and put some of that money in the bank and the rest in a safe deposit box. Make 100 deposits for a few months. Book a trip to a casino, come back a few days later and tell the bank you won $1,500. Rinse and repeat. I am 55, so I can remember some stuff from the 70s. Bet on Secretariat to win the Triple Crown. The odds were low for all 3 races, but the bet to win the Triple Crown before the Derby was probably pretty high. Figure out how to make money off of JFK's assassination, the moon landing, etc. The house I grew up in cost $4,000 back when my parents paid $43,000 for it, and now it's at around $1 million for the house and property. $998K last I looked. Another house we lived in after that one was $64,000 when we got it, and was at $135,000 when we sold it. That one is at $500,000 now. Since my mom sold it, it hasn't really been occupied for 2 decades now. Just goes from one flipper to another. My current home, built in 1968, took a lot of work to update to modern standards when it comes to insulation and wiring, as well as plumbing, but it's a great home. Likely, had anyone else got it, the house would be demolished, and I really liked it as it was. Story 3. Buy property on Las Vegas Boulevard. Knew a guy who did this as a blackjack dealer in the 1950s. All his extra cash buying corner lots on the grid of available properties. The grid eventually became the extended Las Vegas Boulevard, and the dude made tens of millions. Las Vegas is here with a long family history in the town. Had some relatives that bought some land just a couple miles west of downtown. That side of the family is currently very wealthy. They now own one of Howard Hughes' old houses. My grandfather said they will never get water out there. Heck, I now live in that area in a house from 1979. Just buying some land on the edge of town in 1950 would make almost any investor a boatload of money. No mob involvement is needed. Story 4. Work a menial job and invest in IBM. Not sure how regulations like that worked back then, but it would be challenging without any documentation like SS or a BC. SS wasn't required for bank accounts until the mid to late 1980s. A long time ago. I closed a very old account, and you should have heard the bank teller when she discovered it had no social security number attached. Also, depending on how old you are, people wouldn't even expect you to have a birth certificate since so many people were born at home. People would often use church records to show their date of birth. All those tricks you see on TV shows like using the birth certificate of someone who died young, they'd still work in 1950. The plan is totally screwed if you're a woman. No agency to own a bank account to do finances. If you're a white woman, perhaps you could undermine the system by buying Cadillacs in cash to sell to black celebrities for a commission. For yourself, be distinctive and get an Oldsmobile Rocket 88 in 1955. Otherwise, you're back to walking a guy as Plan A. Story 5. Why does everyone think IBM was traded in the 1950s? IBM isn't even in the 100 oldest. You want Coca-Cola and Geico, folks. Geico is a good choice. Graham Newman's original 1948 investment of $712,000 was worth over $400 million 25 years later. You'd be investing 2 years later and investing less, but let's say you put half your money in Geico, using the rest to live on. You'd have more than $10 million after 25 years. You can invest in a company prior to the IPO. It'll be locked up prior to being publicly traded, but you can still invest if you can get in touch with the owners. It's pretty clear IBM is mostly being tossed around as a company to be on the lookout for, not necessarily the first thing you do on waking up. I get it, but the reality is no one knows that much about 75 years ago day to day. People say sports betting and such, but as a sports fan, the best I can do is remember the dynasties of the time. Yankees in the 50s, Celts in the 60s. I'd make bets on those first. Then I'd look at all the companies and stocks available and know that basically, if I know you in 2024, you're probably a very good investment. Like Nintendo was probably still a trading card company. Go buy that. Story 6. It's easy to say that I'd invest it and become a billionaire by 30. But I've thought about what kind of industry I'd go into if I had to live life in the past with today's current knowledge. I'd beg, borrow, and steal to get a job as a regional scout for an MLB team and easily work my way up as a scouting wunderkind until I became the single greatest talent evaluating general manager of all time, leading my team to a dynasty that spanned decades. I can't play baseball, but I sure would be able to pick tomorrow's next superstars if I gotta do it Biff Tannen style. I think sports is the right answer. Invest and buy an NFL team later down the road. As far as a day job, I'd pick a football coach. With simple strategies used today, I could become a legend rather quickly. Plus, I'd integrate black players ASAP. I get the fame and money. I'd probably buy a movie studio too. That's cool, but the second you do this, you might change things too much. I would argue that most players who became superstars became that good because of their environment, their teammates, but also very specific events like winning a specific game, tournament, or whatever. If you change these events, you might change life-changing experiences for these players. Story 7. Probably end up getting lynched. My first thought was, a lone young black woman in the year 1950 with a briefcase containing $50,000? The best case scenario is they murder me and rob me. Worst case scenario, I get raped and murdered. But provided that I somehow magically can survive until then, I'd find a way to keep the money hidden and then give it to my mom when she turns 18 in 1982. That'd probably open up a big can of worms, namely the grandfather paradox. My mom would have the money to go to college and pursue her dreams, so she never would have met my dad, and I wouldn't have been born. But she'd be happy, I guess. Right? I'm clearly mixed race. And that was hard enough growing up in South Africa as apartheid was being phased out. Showing up in South Africa out of nowhere with no ID, no family support, and a suspicious amount of money 2 years after apartheid is declared? Screw that. Yep, I'd be on the first plane out to Hawaii or wherever the friendliest country in Europe or South America is, quietly invest the money over the next 20 years, build a nice nest egg for my family, and then start taking out certain people who made life hard for people like me, like I had a copy of the Death Note. Oh, and of course, the obligatory hookers and cocaine. Story 8. Women in the US weren't allowed to open their own bank accounts without a husband or father's permission. So I'm kind of screwed. Yes, they were. What the 1974 Act outlawed was discrimination against women opening bank accounts, demanding that married women have their husband's permission, holding single women to higher standards, etc. But women did not automatically need male guardians to sign off on their checking accounts being opened before that. My grandmother was orphaned by age 20, and her only brother was in the military, and she was definitely running her own bank account in 1940. Yes and no. It wasn't that women were not allowed by law to have bank accounts. It was that many banks did not allow it by their individual policies, and the law did not force the bank to allow it. There were some banks that did allow women to have an account, mostly in the larger cities, but you could find them in other places too if you looked hard enough. This is one of those myths based on fact. I'm a trans man, and I'm actually 20. Pre-everything. I do have a binder though. Let's hope I spawn in with it, or else I'm screwed. But I'm not sure if I'll even pass then. Once I have convinced the masses that I am a man, I will proceed to use my newfound wealth to wear all the fancy old-timey men's clothing that I fantasize about wearing, but don't have an excuse to wear because it's too formal by modern standards. I'll also figure out where my queer allies are because trans people have always existed, and try to navigate that. Let's hope a time traveler rescues me before my lack of ADHD/anxiety medication drives me insane. Until then, I will try to minimize my own impact on the timeline because I don't want to cause a weird time paradox or actually make things worse in my attempt to help change things. I feel so bad for the trans femmes who have to deal with this question. Story 9. Invest in stocks. Date Marilyn Monroe. I was gonna say, wait till a guy named Warren Buffett creates a Buffett partnership, buys Berkshire Hathaway, and becomes publicly traded in 1965. Your $50,000 would be worth $900.5 million today. People say invest in stocks, but forget that. Go take that cash and invest it directly into the companies themselves. Apple had a third co-founder absolutely nobody remembers because he sold out before it was worth anything. Imagine being number 4 when that took off. Do that for multiple companies earlier on, and you'll be the richest guy on Earth in a matter of years. From there, you could do anything. Want to be president? Want to go buy off NASA so you can be first on so many space missions? Or just go buy Australia because F kangaroos? Story 10. I was thinking I was going to buy a house, but I'm a woman, so I'm betting I'm not buying a house. Guess I'm buying a fella to help me buy a house. My grandmother grew up in the western USA. Born 1926, she found a bank that let her have her own bank account, and she bought a house as a single woman in 1947/1948, a couple years before she married my grandpa. Several cities out west in the early 20th century didn't care who bought the house as long as the mortgage was paid. A lot of women just married and let their husbands handle it, but many built lives and fortunes of their own, legally. Many times, banking depended on local laws and individual banks. Several places even had lady-owned banks, exclusively for women who couldn't bank elsewhere. What I read is, if you had cash, you could buy property, but most single US women could not have their own bank account or mortgage until 1974. Everyone's getting this wrong. It's married women who couldn't have their own bank account. The married couple was expected to take on the husband's identity. Single women could and did own property and open bank accounts in 1950. Your worst option would be to wear a fake wedding ring because then the banker would expect to talk to your husband. Women in 1950 who had jobs were expected to leave them upon marriage. Marriage pretty much was a job for women. Story 11. Nobody watched Back to the Future 2? Sports betting. Bet on anything and everything. The amount of money you could make off of sure things in the past is nearly unlimited. It wouldn't be hard to turn that $50K into billions at all. I imagine most people would not remember the results of enough games to actually make that sort of money either. Only an absolute diehard would. I'm not a diehard NFL guy, but I could probably remember enough Super Bowl winners to do pretty well. The hard part would be avoiding an investigation. If you're putting a large amount of games and keep winning, the feds will take a look at you. Any bookie with enough cash to pay off your wins at the level you are describing would alone most certainly be mobbed up. So I think you might wind up in a dozen suitcases buried in the Nevada desert if you actually won that much. Also, if you were making huge bets against a sport result, guessing the whole Heisenberg thing might come into play and alter history when someone is paid to throw a game that was supposed to have been won. How long before your presence starts to butterfly effect the results of sports games? I bet you get a few weeks or months at best before your interactions with people radiate out and you start getting different results. You can still bet on strong teams, but it won't be a sure thing. I feel that Back to the Future underestimated the butterfly effect to a massive degree. We're told of the miracle of life, that we start off as the spermatozoa that made it to the egg, but that any other outcome would have resulted in a wholly different being. You don't even need to kill baby Hitler to massively change the future. Just find out where his parents lived, travel 10 months before his birth date, and throw a rock through their window or something. Even if you don't directly blue ball the event itself, it'll likely be enough to change that particular outcome. Story 12. Back in the 1950s, the median Australian house cost around $7,150, or just over double the average income. In the 1960s, it still came in at twice the income, at a higher $12,700. I'm going to buy 5 houses, rent out 4 of them, and live like a frickin' king as I invest in companies and live off the cash. I don't think you'd get that rich renting them out. Extortionate rent rates are a relatively recent phenomenon. The average rent was $42 a month in 1950. Sure, that average is brought down by apartments, and your houses will rent for more, but it's still going to be a pretty small amount compared to today's, where tenants are cash cows for landlords to milk dry. You should invest in your own companies that advance computer technology. That way you can enjoy video games while also making Australia the hub of early internet. I'm not saying you have the wrong idea, but you could easily purchase a polymer research facility and use your knowledge of what modern products would use plastics. Imagine you told your research team to develop malleable storage containers and focus on developing injection molding methodology. Sure, but you need to know something about how to make those plastics to advance the research at a pace that is faster than they are developing, and you don't have that information. Okay, well, I don't have that information. Regardless, wouldn't it be better to push your funds into developing something that isn't as environmentally destructive knowing what you know? Story 13. I'm not sure about what the laws were or were back then, but I do believe it was reasonably easy to adopt a new identity. So I'd establish an identity, then I'd make some wise investments based on what I know now. Buy some acreage at least 50 or so and have a house built. Then I'd just enjoy my relative obscurity. Go to a medium-sized town, go to their public library, look for an infant who passed away 21 years ago, request a copy of their birth certificate, go to another small town and use that birth certificate to get a driver's license and a bank account. Story 14. Bury the suitcase of money somewhere nobody but I can find it. Get registered by claiming to the authorities that I was an unregistered birth. Raised in a rural cult, which I escaped, and do not know enough information to be able to lead authorities to it. If I'm asked for my parents' names, reply with Papa and Mama. Get a basic job, but quickly use my amazing science and statistics knowledge to rise up fast in the world around me. Dig up the $50K and use it to buy a property in a major city like New York or Los Angeles. Invest the rest into companies I know will do well. You don't even have to do the cult thing. If you're 20 in 1950, then your birth date would be 5 years before the 1935 Social Security Act, and lots of babies were born at home. Good point. If you didn't belong to a specific group that was subject to extra scrutiny from the government, you wouldn't have been expected to have government papers. Chinese immigrants and Native Americans born in the reservation system are the two such groups I know of off the top of my head. This means that without birth or immigration documents, my East Asian ass would be toast in this situation. Time to become an undocumented menial laborer in a Chinatown, I guess. Yay! There were Chinese immigrants in the US in the 1850s, and birth certificates weren't a common thing until after World War II. I'm aware of early Chinese immigrants. They're the ones who established said Chinatowns, after all. In the late 1800s, the US government clamped down hard on immigration from China, and by 1917, these restrictions extended to the whole Asiatic barred zone. Members of the Chinese and Japanese communities in the US were strictly cataloged due to concerns about illegal immigration, smuggling, tax evasion, and espionage. After all, in an era of home births and notoriously unreliable census data, how do you suppose the federal government was able to send internment notices to Japanese Americans? A 20-year-old person of Chinese descent in the US in the 1950s would have likely been subject to stricter documentation requirements than the general population. For instance, they wouldn't have been able to just up and change their name to be less politically inconvenient, like many other Americans did throughout the early mid-20th century, to seem less German, less Jewish, less Slavic, etc. You're not following. There were already over 100,000 Chinese in the US, several thousand of them citizens before 1882. If you claimed to be a descendant of one of those, and used some of that $50K to procure some suitable false documentation attesting to that fact in one place, and went to another some distance away, who would know? Story 15. Job at a gas station. Buy a small plot of land, bother no one, take up golf. This literally described my grandfather. He lived till 100. The gas station he worked at in his 20s he bought based on his wages. Ended up owning a couple of stations and then selling them. With no huge profit. Still had 2 pensions from working in technology like TV cameras and television repair, and also still had his retirement from the army after World War II. Tech moved quickly, so he was paid well, vested his pension, and then was laid off as his tech knowledge aged out. With 2 different technologies. He lived an incredibly comfortable life, even adopting kids of deadbeat families, etc., and basically retired at 40-ish in the 1960s. As for golf, he was scoring occasionally under his age for about a decade while he traveled the world and played golf. I'm really starting to think good old grandpa might have been a time traveler. Story 16. Do I have all the knowledge I have now? Because, I'm white and a chemist, with a lot of dark chemist knowledge. I could do unholy things and become a supervillain. This is an underrated comment. I'd go for every Nobel Prize multiple times. Poetry and writing would be the hardest, but I'd have enough cash to do what the F I wanted. Then focus on stacking the government to promote human rights and save the world from climate change before it happens. I'd be more famous than John Lennon, and he was more famous than Jesus. Now you're talking. Though no need to go really evil. I'm a biochemist, and I think inventing the field of molecular biology a decade or 2 early could be really fun. Maybe a side gig with plastics, which were pretty hot in the 50s. Though I know less about it, but grants are easier. Have your pick of brilliant names you know from chemistry history as your grad students. You don't even have to get rich. Just stand on the shoulders of giants in reverse. Change the world for hopefully the better. I.e., this is pre-OPEC superpowered oil company protectionism. And let the Nobels roll in. Story 17. Buy me an identity, pay cash for a house, probably around 6K to 7K, Women couldn't get mortgages then, so I'd sob stories about the recent death of my great-aunt to explain my inheritance, invest, write a book, form a coven, travel with the equivalent of $650,000 in today's dollars. I could do it all. Most of all, I'd color outside the lines, all of the lines. I wonder if an imaginary husband would be an option, though. You can kill him off at some point and be a wealthy widow. Oh, my husband is working in another state. Can we mail the paperwork? No idea if that would work, since I have no experience of being a woman living in the 1950s or even living in the US. Having done all three, I can say with confidence that I'd be told that this is really a man's decision, and they really need to discuss it with him. I suppose I could arrive in widow's black, mourning my late husband's untimely passing, but then they'd ask to speak with my father. Story 18. I'd get out of the South. I'd look for a place that has women's rights and isn't so racist. A very tall order for 1950. Might just have to get up and leave the US. I'm not sure what country would have been better, but I don't want to be a black woman in the South in 1950 with no paperwork. Story 19. I would pretend that I was raised Amish, and I was leaving the church and just sold my furniture-making business. That explains the lack of ID and the cash. Then I'd file for an ID and social security number, which I believe was a thing in the 1950s. Then I'd buy a home and invest my money in McDonald's, plus buy an original Shelby Cobra and periodically continue to buy what will become highly collectible cars. Story 20. I wouldn't do it. I'm a 57-year-old female. My husband and I have been married for 36 years. I have 3 adult children, one with severe autism who we are legal guardians for. I don't want to go through periods again. I don't want to have more children. I don't want to see how ignorant people are about everything that we've learned in the past 50 years. And I would be too afraid of changing anything. Plus, women weren't normally allowed to have checking accounts on their own until the 1970s. Story 21. The Korean War was coming up. I'd make sure to be a war supplier instead of a soldier. Also, invest in the appropriate stocks. Yeah, getting a contract for a weird item the military needed would be a great way to get a fat contract. You have a better or at least more creative idea than 98% of the people here. Wouldn't be surprised if you were pretty successful right now as is. Story 22. First, I would desperately find somewhere quiet and alone to deeply grieve the loss of my husband and children. I would be distraught, wondering if they still existed in some universe somewhere, if they knew why I had left, if another version of me was still there. I would plead and pray to God that I would see them again on the other side of heaven. In Orange County, I'd try to find my dad's childhood home. I think I remember the address. I saw an old black and white picture of the front of the house once. My dad would have been a toddler. I would have tried to find a way to introduce myself to my grandmother and see if I could babysit for her. We'd laugh about the coincidence of having the same name. I'd charge very little money, as I know things were a little tight for them. And then if they let me, I would shower my dad with love and joy and happy days together at the park or Disneyland, or just in their little backyard. And I would help him to learn to love himself and to see his worth. Even when he came home from elementary school having been bullied for being the fat kid, or the kid with the yellow tooth from having it knocked out by a dumb batter on the baseball field one day, I always found his story of shoving his tooth back in place both horrifying and impressive. I'd listen and talk and always be there for him when his dad got mean. My dad always said my grandfather was a man born at the wrong time, never finding his place, hopping from job to job and finding solace in the bottle. My grandmother and dad adored each other and were all the closer as the two easiest targets for my grandfather's anger. My grandmother was an artist and writer, and everyone who had ever described her to me noted how slowly she walked, looking at each flower growing in a sidewalk crack. I would delight in getting to know her. I would hope that I would help my dad prepare for her death when he was a young man, so that he too didn't then fall prey to the depression, alcoholism, and demons that haunted his father. Maybe the little bit of love I got to show him would keep him out of prison, keep him from dying young, keep him from dying with the face of regret that still haunts me to this day. And in the off hours, who knows? Who cares? My life would seem to be not my own anymore. I would go to Mass and sit with the Lord. I would sit on the beach and watch the waves. I'm sure there would be a cat waiting on my bed in whatever little house I bought. I'd buy the homeless guys in my neighborhood whatever takeout was their favorite, and maybe we'd enjoy a coffee together sometime. I'd pick up the guitar. I'd always wanted to learn how to play my dad's old guitar. And then, when he was grown and off to college, I'd give him the biggest hug and make sure we agreed that we would send each other Christmas cards each year. I'd make him promise to include pictures and one of his famous funny doodles. And I don't know if I could ever see him again. The closer he got to my timeline, the more I thought I would have to pull away. I don't know why. Laws of the universe, I guess. And then I would move up north. On my way, I'd stop by my mom's farm and buy some fruit from her and her siblings at their little roadside stand. She was younger than my dad, so would have been a preteen then. Maybe I'd spend the afternoon watching them play, watching my grandfather drive the tractor and my grandmother baking. Watch one last sunset from the back lawn as it falls over the fruit trees. Then up I'd get, off I'd go. One last glimpse as the kids tumbled back towards the farmhouse, fighting and laughing and dirty from the day of playing in the red clay. And I'd drive and settle up in the mountain north, and try to find my way into being a little old church lady at my current in-laws' church. I'd make sure to be there for my mother-in-law when she gave birth to my husband, bringing her hot-cooked meals and holding her baby boy so that she could get some sleep. And I wound up looking into that baby's eyes and telling him that I loved him, and that he was the most special little boy in the world. And when I got in my car and drove home, I would sit in my driveway and sob and mourn my old life, and wonder who that special little boy would grow up to love. But I'd keep coming back and helping like little old church ladies do, and when my husband's brother died as a baby, I would do everything I could to help my mother-in-law through her depression, and to help shelter my husband from the pain that rippled through the family for years after. And just like my dad, I would be there to listen when he came home after being bullied after he left for school, feeling like $1,000,000 in his new Power Ranger shoes, only to step back off the bus that afternoon crying because the popular kids called him a baby. I'd be there for his sports games no matter if he sat on the bench most of the time. I'd play Lego with him and delight in his creations. I'd smile and say I liked Barney too. And I'd make sure that one time he and his sister burnt Pop-Tarts, they wouldn't catch the kitchen on fire. And when he hinted at leaving childhood, when I saw glimpses of the man I had known in my past life and the little boy I'd imagined was leaving, I would make sure we had a very special day. A day with ice cream sandwiches and smiles and laughter. And I would tell him just one more time to always believe in himself and that no matter what he did or what friends he had or what he grew up to be, he mattered and was a blessing to all who knew him. And then I would fade away from his life, maybe tell my mother-in-law that I had a family who needed me far away, or maybe just trusted that as he entered adolescence, he would move on without question in the bittersweet way only kids can. And I'd try to remember those sweet times and not be driven mad with longing and curiosity to see and know him again. And by this time, I'd be in the last chapters of my life, and the heaviness of the losses lived over and over again would make my chest heavy and my soul weary. I'd spend some long days in the mountains watching sunrises in prayer, hoping all I knew and believed in God and heaven was true, and that this strange twist of fate would still end in a life of eternity with my loved ones on the other side of the veil. I'd go back home, maybe volunteer in a hospital to sit with those who had no one else to sit with them. Who knows? Maybe be that person in the hospital myself. Maybe volunteer in the NICU and hold the little ones while their mamas rested, aching inside to hold my babies once again. And I'd share all the love and the hope I could share until my body and spirit were too tired to go on. Then I'd make sure to leave all that money to some wonderful charity that would keep helping others to share some love and hope when I was gone. Then I'd pray to Saint Joseph for a happy death, and I'd long to walk with Sister Death into the next life, where I could hold my loved ones again and never let go. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these ones that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.